The following program is produced by Marshfield Community Television.
This is the Mayor's Proclamation for Historic Preservation Month, and it states, whereas the National Trust for Historic Preservation established May as Historic Preservation Month in 1973 as a way to promote historic places for the purposes of installing national and community pride, promoting heritage, tourism, and showing the social and economic benefits of historic preservation. And whereas the Wisconsin Historical Society recognizes May as Historic Preservation Month and sponsors annual events around the state of Wisconsin to instill awareness and promote the historic assets in Wisconsin. And whereas the City of Marshfield's Historical Society and associations acknowledge that Historic Preservation Month activities still instill greater awareness and appreciation of the local historical significant buildings and landmarks to community members. And whereas This Place Matters is the theme for National Historic Preservation Month 2017. And whereas Marshfield's Main Street matters to the community, It Happened on Main Street is the theme for the City of Marshfield's Historic Preservation Month this year. And whereas Marshfield's Main Street is the historical heart of our community. Now therefore, I, Chris Meyer, do recognize May 2017 as National Historic Preservation Month and hereby proclaim May as Historic Preservation Month in the City of Marshfield, and call upon the residents of Marshfield to join their fellow citizens across the United States in recognizing and participating in this special observance. Thank you, Don.
Anyway, as Chris said, the theme for this year is It Happened on Main Street. And to get Historic Preservation Month going, we thought what we'd do is kind of go back to our historical roots downtown and talk about each of the blocks on Main Street this summer or over the next several months. We're not going to do everything tonight because I can tell you that if you start telling the stories about the different blocks, it will take too long. So tonight, the idea was that we were going to start with the 100 block of South Central. And in the finished product, it's going to only be the west side of Central Avenue that we're going to talk about tonight. And we'll come back and get together again in a couple weeks and do the east side of Central Avenue. But we'll start with It Happened on Main Street, and we'll talk specifically about the 100 block of South Central. Now, one of the things that kind of put this together was last year at the Northwood County Historical Society, we had an opportunity to work with Pediment Publishing. They went through a lot of the pictures at the Historical Society and prepared this book. The Historical Society has a number of copies of the book for sale. This is my shameless plug that if you want a copy of it, it's a good book, great pictures, contact the Historical Society. They're $39.95. We're going to talk about the west side of Central Avenue, and we're just going to go back and forth. So what I did here was put two pictures. One was taken on Sunday, so it's a current picture of what the west side of Central Avenue looks like. And the other one was taken sometime in the 1950s. And you can see that the buildings have changed, the colors have changed, they're in color. But a lot of things change every day around here, and we don't tend to think about it. We just, they've painted, they've taken out the windows, they put in new windows. But when you go back and look at the structures, you can actually see major changes that have occurred on our downtown city streets. And so we're going to talk about some of those changes, we're going to talk about some of the people, and we're just going to talk about some stories. And so we'll start with the first building on the block that's standing there now. The address today is 126-132 South Central Avenue. And I thought the first thing we should talk about as far as changes is the fact that when the city was first platted out and they started building buildings, they had 11-foot or 22-foot lots. And then in the 1940s, they changed it. And so all the street addresses changed. So what was 112 South Central in 1939 became 126 South Central in 1940. And so when it comes to looking at the different buildings, if you're looking for addresses, you have to look for different addresses at different times. And as we go through the talk tonight, you'll see the current address across the top and the previous address down below. Okay? All right. So we recognize these buildings, this building here. My pointer doesn't work. We recognize this building here as being kind of the anchor to the north end of the west side of South Central Avenue. It's a building that's been there actually since the fire, after the fire. The first building that was finished after the Marshfield fire in 1887 was this building right here. A guy named Thomas Mersch had come to Marshfield in, I think it was about 1884, and he had a hotel that was sitting on that spot. In the fire of 1887, it was burnt and destroyed. He was one of the gentlemen that said, I'm going to rebuild. And he had the foundation, I don't have it written down here, but he had the foundation poured or ready by July, and was open for business sometime in August. You know, when you think about the people downtown, the resilience, the ability to come back from a major catastrophe like that and start opening businesses, it's pretty amazing. Now, this was the first building built in that area. It stayed as a single building for a couple of years, and then in, I think it was 1903, the owner of the building added another building to the north of it. And that's the one we think of as, if you look at that building, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? Jimmy's Cafe, okay. It actually isn't Jimmy's Cafe anymore, but that's still the thing that the name that we all associate with it. And so this building was actually put up as a second building about 20 years later, in 1903.
Like you mentioned, this is what really starts the west side of Central, as we know it, as far as on the west side. And it starts at First Street. What's interesting when you get to the other side of the street, there was a time when the buildings on the east side were adjacent to South Depot Street, and it's getting a little bit into it, but on the north side of the tracks it was North Depot Street, and that's changed through the years. We talk about changes. From Central Avenue to the east, the one that was replaced by the Parkway was actually South Depot Street. Through there, but the First Street going south from there, like we said, everybody knows it as Jimmy's Cafe, but there's a lot of other businesses that have gone in there since then. That was probably the longest that anybody can recall that it was Jimmy's, and it was definitely a landmark in the downtown area.
It was a place that everybody went to.
Yeah.
Everybody, if you either went there after school, you went there after the bars closed, Sunday morning after church, you know, it was a place where everybody in every generation went and visited. So
They had their morning coffee clutch. It was open on Christmas Day in 1956 because my father-in-law went there after my wife was born and got himself a meal, and she was born on Christmas Day. So.
since Jimmy's closed in 2001. Anybody know what was going on in Marshfield in 2001? Parkway, the boulevard here. And it messed up the traffic on Central Avenue. And a number of businesses struggled that year. The businesses, the newspapers account say they were down 75% because the traffic flow on Central Avenue didn't work. We lost a couple businesses that year. Jimmy's Cafe was one. Edgetown Bar was another one. That they just, I'm not going to deal with this, and they closed down. Jimmy's Cafe had been in business since 1937 at that location. So it was like 64 years they had been the same family running the business. And that's one of the things that you see on Central Avenue when you start looking at the history of the businesses and buildings, is this transfer from generation to generation. The grandfather started it, the children continued it, the grandchildren went on after that. And I think that's one of the things that's neat about our downtown. Now, if you look at the list here, there's other businesses that have been in there since Jimmy's left. 2.5 Cups is the current business in there. Simply from the Hearth was in there. There were some other ones also that have gone in. Most of them have been restaurant-type businesses, and that's a history that gets traced way back. That building wasn't just a restaurant with the Wilcott family. Before that, there was a gentleman in town named Chick. Anybody ever hear of Chick's Cafe? Well, Chick's Cafe was the restaurant that was there when Jimmy took over, when Jim Wilcott purchased it. He had a reputation for making something called chicken Spanish. And when John Christner was still alive, that was one of the things he talked about. And if you listen to some of the older generation, they would talk about going to Chick's restaurant on Sunday nights for chicken Spanish. It was a special. And then before that, there was another, this is actually when it was Chick's Cafe, but before that, it had belonged to a gentleman that called or changed the name to the Majestic Hotel. And he was the one who put in place a restaurant in the lower part of the business. And he went from having just a hotel to also serving meals. And you know, think about some of the places you go out to eat now. Buffets are really popular. Back in the 1900s, early 1900s, he started a buffet in this restaurant. And that was a big attraction for his restaurant, was bring people in for buffets. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is when our ancestors or our community members built a building, they used all of it. And some of the buildings in the downtown had basements that they used for business spaces. Barbershops were really good down in the basement. And some of them had the upstairs. And a lot of the stores downtown had upstairs office spaces that were used for different businesses. At this building here, the Jimmy's building, the upstairs from 1937 to 38 belonged to a woman named Lucille, who had a beauty shop in there. And then in 1938, a lady named Elaine opened up Maudell's. And I was hoping Jan Thomas would be here because I know she'd know her. But one of the things about this is connections. And Maudell is somehow related to the Mitten family. And when you went downtown, there were lots of interconnections between families that were business people in town. And that was one I thought that she might be able to explain. Clarence Mitten's wife was a sister. Yeah. But it's interesting when you look at this to see the connections with the people in the downtown district. Now, Maudell, at one point there was an advertisement that she was selling her business sometime in the 50s, but yet she was giving scholarships to the local high school and universities in the 80s in the name of Maudell's Beauty Salon. You got one?
No, but I had my hair done.
Oh.
Yep, on the upstairs floor.
Yeah. So one of the things about the buildings is to think about how they were used, and they were used for more than just the main floor. After Maudell's went out, and I'm thinking it was sometime in the late 80s or mid 80s, because I know that's about when you started to see people rent the apartments upstairs on a month-to-month basis. So. And stories are important. I like stories. And we were talking about how good Jimmy Wilcott was. He got it from his dad. And his dad, Jim and Helen Wilcott, are really the ones that started the restaurant. Actually, they got married in 1920, and they had restaurants from the time they got married at different locations in Marshfield. I know the first one was on the corner of 4th Street and Central, what was referred to as the Eckes Building, across the road from your antique store. I don't know if it was upstairs or downstairs or where it was, but I know it was that building. When they got married in 1920, they started saving silver dollars for their wedding anniversary. They wanted to take their 25th wedding anniversary, and they were saving silver dollars to take the trip. When World War II started, their son enlisted, and they used that money to buy a bond rather than to take their own anniversary honeymoon. So it's kind of the character that they set a good example for their son, and that same example was set where we could all see what Jimmy Wilcott did in the community too. So, And then I mentioned that it was 64 years. I pulled this out of the paper today. In 2001, they closed, and you think about a business, you know, a brick building sitting on the street. I don't think you think about the impact that that building can have. And this starts off, I don't know how many of you know Mickey Golden, but she talks about her husband proposing to her. And then they went, I don't know if it was, they went in afterwards, but proposed to her outside of the restaurant in 1955. There's all sorts of little unique connections to the businesses downtown. It's either the people, events, or places, and they're worth remembering. The other thing that I get a kick out of is the number of people that in obituaries mentions the time that they spent at Jimmy's Cafe drinking coffee and talking to people. You know, there's a connection that it's really a unique connection for this community. So Jimmy's was a tough business to lose downtown. The next business to Jimmy's Cafe building, I think has an interesting story, and that has to do with what it looks like and how it changed from the time that it first was built. Again, there's two buildings there. They're on 22-foot lots, so they're 22 feet wide buildings. The one on the right was a two-story building right away. When it was put up, it was erected as a two-story building. And when it was first built in the 1880s, after the fire, one of the first business people that had that shop was the Mecklers. Everybody's familiar with Meckler Jewelry in Marshfield. That was where Mecklers were. Actually, I'm going to just skip ahead. Oops, I guess I'll keep going where I'm at here. So anyway, this is 116 and 118 South Central, the old names. And when it comes to the businesses that have been in there, a lot of saloons. Mr. G's is the current saloon. It was after hours before that. Kathy's Pub. Before that, Nigg's Bar from 1946, and Chick's Bar in 1944. So there's a long history of it being a bar, and that's standard for Marshfield. We have a lot of bars in Marshfield. But it's unique to see that they've been in the same place for as long as they have been. The other place next to it has also had a lot of different businesses in it. Currently, there's a place called Amber Waves Farm Boutique. Weebin Photography was in there for about 11 years. There was a tropical pet store there for a year. Second Chance was like not a flea market, but a resale shop, collectibles and things like that. And then Lindcrest Kitchens and Milady's Beauty Shop. Milady's has a really long history. She started business in 1945 and didn't quit until 1998. And when she quit, it was because of health reasons. And that's the other thing that I think is important to remember, because a lot of our businesses downtown, it's either circumstances related to financial things that are impacting business. And sometimes it's because other things are impacting your ability to do the business. And so she retired in 1998, and the business has had other owners since then. What I think is neat about it is that we're in a historic district. This one is the one when I saw this, I thought it reminded me of something that happened last year, 2 years ago. But up and down Central Avenue, we have all these historic buildings, and all of them had residences. And before that, we had, water that was taken directly to the house through pipes or the community waterworks. They had wells. And in this one here, this is a picture that was taken in 1991 in the back parking lot of the After Hours Bar. Truck was backing out, broke through the ground, and there's a 21-foot hand-dug well there that had 9 feet of water in it. Now, it doesn't happen often. 1991, they found that one. And then when they were doing East 4th Street, I understand, they found a well out where Goldbach's blacksmith shop would have been. There was a dug well there that they had to fill in before they finished the road work there. So there's little reminders that we have a historic district out there that sometimes they go unnoticed, and sometimes they make the news in the newspaper. And then there's this. Mike, do you remember that picture?
That solved a lot of problems in the city. So they finally decided to pave Central Avenue. You see a lot of older pictures. You can date the city by whether or not Central Avenue is paved or not. And prior to the paving, there were several attempts to keep people out of the mud. There were boardwalks across Central. There were, of course, boardwalks along from the buildings, and then they went with concrete. But to really date pictures in the downtown area, whether or not the paving blocks were in place or not, it's quite an operation, and it didn't just include Central Avenue. It included a lot of the off streets, 1st Street, 2nd Street, all the way down to 6th Street. I'm not sure about 7th, but to either one block, either side of it, were until recently some of them were still the paving block underneath. It was a big step up for the city.
Yeah, and that was in September of 1915 that they finished the brick paving of Central Avenue. And it was, like Mike said, it made Marshfield really a first-class town. Can you imagine women with long dresses walking across Central Avenue in a rain, or the rain we've had late? Oh,
Well, they carried shingles underneath their arm
oh.
so they could put it down and get across.
Piece by piece.
Okay. All right. So anyway, there's another thing that I wanted to show on this picture, and that has to do with this building. Now, we started talking about the first building on Central Avenue on the south side, on the west side of the street. And we said it was this one here, the Jimmy's Cafe building. But look, there's another building there. And this is one of the things that happens when you live in a historic district. Sometimes progress takes things away. And in 1926, this building, which was actually the second building finished after the Marshfield fire, the Reconstruction period, was taken to make way for a gas station. The reason that building always kind of pops up in my mind is because Anton Kleinheit's, that's the house that I live in. And here's a story that appeared in the Marshfield paper talking about the building being taken down, who the family members were that worked there, and things like that. But Kleinheit's building was around for quite a while, and it was actually a mercantile store that was started by Ernst Schmidt, and then later on it was sold to Kleinheit's. Yeah.
So is the Domino's Pizza building today, was that the gas station?
No, there was a gas station there, but that's, that they put up a new building. Now, the reason I pulled that picture out is because I wanted to show something. This is the Meckler building. This was a picture that was in the Marshfield Memories book, and this address is 116 South Central. The building next to it belonged to a guy named Ernst Wagner. I think he was a barber, but I won't swear to it, but there's a barber pole there. He died, and then that building went up for sale. But what we have here is a 2-story building here that belonged to the Mecklers, and then a 1-story building that was next to it. And if you look at the picture here, you can count the buildings. Here's the Jimmy's Cafe building, what we knew as the Hastings Sports building next to it, and then what would have been the Meckler building, and you see that you had 2 low buildings then, okay? One of the things that you have to do when you're trying to look at pictures is do a lot of comparison. Because when you look at that today, here's this building, you've got a tall one, a low one, and then you have 2 tall ones. So something's changed in there, and then you got to figure out what it was.
The guy on top of the pull up anything?
Mike, what kind of pole is that? That'd be a power pole, okay. I'm not sure, but there's a guy down there that's making sure he doesn't fall.
Taking pictures to be proof.
Yeah. Anyway, what happened was Meckler moved. 1921, he bought the old National Bank, which was next to Rose Brothers store. The old Upham store, and right next to it was a bank. And when that was vacated and they moved to another bank, Meckler moved down there for his business. And that's where he kept operated out of for the next 20 or 30 years. That left this building vacant. There was a guy who had been in this building who had a plumbing shop, a guy named Leo Lights. And about that same time that Meckler moved, he and his wife started traveling. They went out west, then they spent some time in Wausau, and then they came back to Marshfield and thought, we liked Marshfield, and went ahead and bought this building to put up the Lights plumbing supply. So he had his plumbing shop there. And then Mr. Wagner died, and that building became available. And so in December, I've got all this written down here, in December, he purchased that building. And then he started changing them. And over a series of events, first he did this, then he did that, eventually we come out with these two-story buildings side by side that match each other. So in 1927, he bought that, and the first thing he did was he modernized the little one-story building that he just purchased. Put a new storefront. Oh, this is this is the big building, the two-story one. He took the plumbing building, he put a new storefront on it so it looked modern. 1927, you get that kind of, what style is that, Shirley? What? Kind of Art Deco or, yeah. So it's real boxy and not as elaborate as what the originals were. He put a basement in. A lot of the buildings downtown didn't have basements when they were first built. And so he put a basement in, and then he added space to the back side of the building, made it deeper. And that served its purpose as well for a few years. And then in 1930, he did some remodeling again. And I think that's what's funny when you think about this is the first thing he talks about is he lowered the floor. How often have you gone into a house and thought about lowering your floor? Have you ever noticed the streets on Central Avenue, how you step up to go into those old stores? When the city was built, the stores were all built up high. The boardwalk that went across the front was a couple steps up, and then you could walk directly into the store. Well, he wanted to make it so that you could just walk in after the cement sidewalks were put in. And so he lowered the floor about 15 inches so that you just walked in on flat ground. Look the next time you walk into like Main Street Marshfield or any of the stores. You always are taking a step up to go into them unless they've done that. The other thing he did at that same time in 1930 was he took the entire front of the building and made it match the other one. Now it doesn't say he added a second story, but in order to make it work, he had to have added a second story at the same time. And that's why when you look at the picture, you see this kind of square building that has matching windows and everything else. So when you look at this, here, this building was remodeled to match that one. And it changes the way the address looks, or where the avenue looks there, and gives you kind of an eclectic appearance of architectural styles. And it's just because people wanted to modernize it. Now, Mr. Lights had a kind of an interesting history. He was one of these people that liked to do things for himself. And 3 years later, 1933, he was up on the roof of those buildings. He was on the top of 116 South Central. There were some loose bricks in the chimney. He was up there trying to straighten them out, and he fell off the roof, broke his leg, broke his pelvis, and a couple days later he died. And so those businesses actually ended up going to somebody else after he had them all remodeled. But there's connections. One of the things I like to think about when I look at the history of downtown is the connections. Leo Lights hired people and trained them to be plumbers. One of the people that worked with Leo Lights was a guy named Henry Schreiner. Henry Schreiner was Fred Schreiner's son, or brother. And Fred Schreiner, he had a son named Elmer, who's kind of the patriarch of the Schreiner plumbing here. So here's a guy who was running a business back in the 1920s and 30s, and he's still connected to people running businesses here in town today. Want to handle this one? Okay, this is probably, if you were in a group of people from Marshfield 20 years ago and you mentioned this name, no, actually, if we mention this name today, you will recognize it. The other little one-story building that was on Central Avenue was a building that was, or business that was started in 1880. It was a harness maker. It came to Marshfield in 1879. About that time, William Upham started to expand, and he needed people to do saddles and harnesses and horse collars and things like that. And so a guy named Simon Flum came to Marshfield, and he started a business. Now, one of the things that's kind of unique about him is that he was one of those businesses that stayed around forever. He started in 1880, and it wasn't until 1954 in October that he closed down. And again, this is one of those situations where you could say that his business had probably outlived its usefulness, because in the mid-1950s, you probably weren't using harnesses and things like that the way you were in the 1880s. But Mr. Flum's health was getting bad, and so he retired, and a few months later he passed away. But the Simon Flum Harness Shop was one of those businesses on Central Avenue that had been there forever. Oops, and I did it again. Here's a picture of the inside and the outside of the Flum Harness Shop. It had been there for 74 years. Simon's father was also Simon, and he started it. And when he stepped down, young Simon came in and operated it for 55 years. There are still family members connected to that family here in town yet. But it's one of those stories about, you know, the connections to Marshfield and stuff. Shirley.
Couple things. The elder, Mr. Flum, was in the Civil War.
Yes, he was.
And we have at the museum his GAR medal, and the lanyard was his wife wove out of her hair. Right. But then Vern Baltus used to tell me that he would just go in the harness shop just to smell the leather. He told me that story many times. So it had just that aroma that enticed him to go in. And we also have Mrs. Flum's washing machine, copper washing machine, which we'll add to the new museum.
House.
The Flum House on Arnold?
A mother and her son lived in it, and it was where Dr. Opitz lived out on Highway 97.
Yep.
That was their home, an elegant home, beautiful woodwork in it.
Yes. So anyway, we lose people, you know, basically, you know, everybody's going to age out eventually, and that's one of the situations that's too bad when you see a business with strong family ties and strong connections to the community's history leave us. You know, they talk about when an older person dies, you lose a library. I'm sure that the Flum family had lots of stories to share about Uphams, the blacksmith shops in town, horses and things like that. So it's a loss. The next one is 148 South Central. I don't have a good picture of what that building looked like in the good old days. And this was the site that actually for a long time was the Wenzel Meats place. Albert Wenzel and his nephew William came to Marshfield in 1901. And Albert Wenzel started this meat place on Central Avenue. There was a Star Meat Market, and there was another name. I didn't write it down. There was another name, City Market, that they had too. And that business was in place from 1901 to 1941, when Carl, his son, actually came in and bought him out and became Carl Wenzel and Son. Now, Carl Wenzel was in business till sometime in the 60s also. I think that was 1965 that he retired finally. And that Wenzel family in the meat business went away. There is no longer a connection to that. It's not the same Wenzel as Wenzel Farm Sausage. That belongs to William Wenzel's families or descendants. But the Wenzels on Central Avenue were another one of those businesses that had a long history of having a meat market. I found a picture of the inside of that meat market, and it just scared me. And the reason it made me kind of question, where did they slaughter the animals? You know, because you wouldn't think about a slaughterhouse being on Central Avenue. And so I did some digging, and it turns out that they actually had a slaughterhouse on Becker Avenue, or Becker Road. And that's where they slaughtered the animals, and they brought them back to the butcher shop, the sausage room, and things like that to process the meat.
There's also a Robert Wenzel, that whole family, and he was part of it too up until the 60s, and then it was dissolved.
Yeah, and Robert was Carl's son. So, you know, it's interesting how we keep families together in businesses in the good old days. So, and even today we do that. And then the next two buildings, 154 and 156 South Central. You can see the sign here, and that's, you know, Heinz and Printing. The old White Printing Company was at that address. And because Heinz and Printing moved, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them tonight, but one of the things that I thought that was important is, again, it's the generations. It was Ben Heinzen, then it was Jerry Heinzen, and now it's his sons, Rick and Mike, that run the business. And we have lots of examples of businesses that go different across the generations. And when you look at the Heinzens, it's another family that very supportive of family organizations or business organizations, church organizations here in town. And it's a pattern that you see, the businessmen in Marshfield supporting the community. And this is just a good chance to say thank you to everybody. And I know there's more than we've talked about tonight, but there's a lot of businesses that do contribute to the welfare of the community.
In an effort to upgrade the buildings, well, the Heinzens changed the facade, which it was prior to the concern in the community for, let's step back and make it look like it used to look, or fix the facade in its original condition. There are some nice facades behind all that, which you can see in the bottom picture. There were some unique buildings. There's only one stone that remains too, and it's called Lars, but there's also a mast and one other one that were part of the original buildings that were refaced at one point.
Yeah, this is an example of, when we do restoration work or preservation work, it gives us that eclectic look downtown, and that's okay. It wasn't common back even in the 70s, you had 60s and 70s, to want to upgrade the look of the building. The one was the McCrory building. There's two beautiful buildings behind that facade. And at some point, it would be nice to be able to talk to the property owner into taking those off there like they did on the corner a couple stores down and fix it up the way it ought to be, because there's a lot of hidden stuff out there. And it's not uncommon for cities to encourage that, because Chippewa Falls had a bank on a corner building, and once they talked them into taking all the steel mesh and stuff off the front of at one time made it look modern. It got back to the original. It's a key building in their downtown area historically. All right, so we're going to talk about Heinzen. One of the things I want to mention is we're going to be doing these over the summer. And Heinzen, because it's in the 500 block, we'll talk about when we get down there now. 160 South Central, originally it was 124 and 126 South Central. It's a building, I kind of struggled to find the history that I was looking for on it. It has a lot of history, as far as businesses over the last 20 years. 2009, we had the Fringe. They're still in business. The Style Inn was there for about 10 to 20 years before that. The Barnyard took that as a temporary location for a year or two. There was a couple that were just in for a short period of time. And then we have the Hat Shop and Bee's Dress Shop and Hat Shop. The Hat Shop was in business before 1930. She sold to Bees in 1964, so it's another one of those businesses that ran continuously for, 50 years in the same location. It's not one that we recognize when we go downtown, that you're looking down, walking down the street, you don't think, oh, that was Bees Dress Shop, or that was the Hat Shop. But there were a lot of specialty shops on Central Avenue for a long time. It's not just that that's something new now. And I think it's worth remembering that that was going on or occurring. The next building over is one that I always liked, because when I'd walk to school, Adler's Bakery was there. I still went to the Purdy Junior High School. I would walk, and before I got to school, I could stop and get a cinnamon roll. And I liked that. That was a good place. Years later, it became Gerald's, and now it's Thimbleberry Books. But when the building was first put up, this is the building here. It was put up by a guy named Albert Bartman. This is Albert standing here. I think was it a Spectre Regenfuss that's standing next to him, and then his daughter Amanda. Anybody who is connected to Marshfield history has got to recognize the name Amanda Heinrichs, or Heinrichs. And that's this little lady here, or young girl there. She grew up to be classified or called Marshfield's First Lady of History. The News Herald published her obituary and said Marshfield's First Lady of History passed. She received awards from the state. She's the lady who wrote all the recorder columns. So from 1944 to 1964, she wrote a weekly column in the Marshfield News Herald that front page that documented the history of this community. She would go through newspapers, page by page, those big old bound books, and write stories on a weekly basis. Her daughter was Marie Carruthers. Marie was a lady that helped us on the Marshfield history book in the 1990s, the first Marshfield history book. And she gave us this picture for that book, and then she also shared a lot of things that her mother did when she was still alive. Marie Carruthers was her daughter. She lived right out by the airport, out by one of the Bell farms. Yeah. But Marie was a pretty amazing woman. At 97 years old, some of the things that she would do, she would help us proofread the history books, and believe me, she learned her history from her mother. She could correct you and make sure all the facts are right. So 166 South Central is kind of interesting. Now, where I run into problems is I got to be able to prove this yet. I find that this guy, Joseph Cole, who was referred to as the Marshfield Bakery Man before the Marshfield fire, lived at that address. He had a outside bakery or outside oven behind the store. I don't know if it's that building, though, or if it's the next building. So that's something I've got to try to verify yet. We do know that in 1891, Bartman's came to town and he opened the shoe store. And the Bartman name is spelled Bartmann. But when they put up the sign, there wasn't room for the second N, and so he just put it up without one N. So the sign says A. Bartman Shoes, but when you talk about it or see the writing, it's spelled out the correct way. And that was one of those things that Marie, because she knew, could share with us. Bartman was in and out of that shoe store for a little while, and then some tailors came in. There's a break-in here, and there's the possibility that there was a billiard room there. And I've got to verify that yet. But they actually had a couple billiard tables or sets on Central Avenue, and that's supposed to be one for a short period of time in there. Wensing and Fitzgerald split up a couple years after they started their business. Fitzgerald took it over on his own, and it was a dry cleaning place. Then they bring back shoes. Then they start selling real estate out of there. And then the long history, the one that we all kind of associate with that building, starts when the Adlers open up the Vienna Bakery. And Vienna Bakery is there until 1929 when there's a fire. And then there's a couple other businesses go in there for a while, and then later on it's operated again as the Adler Bakery through 1966, and then Jerry's Bakery after that. Jerry's Bakery was there until 1971, and then they moved to the north side of town. Were they in J&J Sports? Or it was right in that block, on that, where the Quick Trip is now. That's where Jerry's Bakery went after it left Central Avenue. But that was a good timing because then Gerald's could come in, and Gerald's was there until 2002, 3, or 4, and then Thimbleberry Books moved in after that.
What's interesting is that where they were located, the Adler Bakery, they were located right next to the Hotel Charles, which was the place to go. The noon hour, the Rotary, any large organizations had gatherings there before we had our other conference centers, and the Holiday Inn was another choice at the time after that. But it was located right next to there, so any of the hot buns and bread and things that were served at the Hotel Charles were just taken out the back door and into the back door of the Hotel Charles and served as part of the meals.
And Hotel Charles became the place to go and eat at one time. Up until the time the Hotel Charles was built, Blodgett House was the place to go and eat. In 1926, when Hotel Charles was built, then they moved all the restaurant and things to the Hotel Charles, and started it there.
A lot of weddings, we're into that building now, but a lot of weddings, a lot of proms, a lot of, like I said, the Nuno Rotary Club and all service clubs and stuff met there. It was a place to go.
They had a lot of elegant things there. My in-laws belonged to a dance club that met there once or twice a month, and you had to wear long dresses to these dances.
Yeah.
It was the place to go. And I remember, I was kind of in there at the end of the time for the hotel, but I remember going to weddings there. Rotary had their luncheons there. Lions Club met there. A lot of different organizations met there. So we're talking about Hotel Charles, and Hotel Charles is one of those beautiful buildings that really anchor our downtown. You just can't say anything but good things about what that building looks like on Central Avenue. And it really continues or carries on the tradition of hotels on that location, because from the time Marshfield was established in the 1870s, there was a hotel sitting on that corner. There's a whole list of different names, and we'll get to that in a minute, I guess. The reason I included this picture was because the sign ordinance wasn't in place yet. And you could see the hotel from miles away. And then down below you see that Radio Shack was in there. I can't read what that one is now. There were a number of businesses that occupied or filled the front part of the basement or the first floor of the hotel. JCPenney was in there. China Chef was there, the establishment was there, and we will talk about those, but I was figuring that if I tried to talk about everything tonight, you'd kick me out of here, or we'd be kicked out.
El Sombrero was
there.
Part of the hotel.
So anyway, there's the hotel, and it's a big, beautiful building. This is the hotel when it was built. When it was first built in 1926, it only went back as far as the alley. It was one of these kind of buildings that was put up in 2 phases. When Blodgett had it built, it went up to the alley, and then 2 or 3 years later he wanted to expand it, and so he crossed the alley and he goes back along 2nd Street over the tops of the businesses that were there. He had worked it out with them, and he could have built it right over the top of it. He would have liked to have gone all the way to the alley, but there was someone who had a garage back there that didn't want it. And so the building stops, like half a block from, or quarter of a block from Chestnut Street, because there was a businessman there that didn't want to cooperate. But it's a big, beautiful building. And one of the things about Mr. Blodgett is he always made sure things got done. I mentioned the alley. This is a picture of Mr. Blodgett here. And he was probably one of the most important movers and shakers in Marshfield during his time. And when it came to downtown, if he wanted something done, he would work with people to get it to happen. And we were talking about street paving in that one picture on Central Avenue, the front part. He wanted the alleys done. And so all of the business owners, he worked with them to get them to petition the city to actually pour concrete in the alley sometime in the 1920s. He was the kind of guy that when something was for the better, would better the city, he was willing to work with people to make it happen. Charles Blodgett, and he was a big, really important to Marshfield, but he also shared something in common with this guy. And I don't think we could sit and talk about Central Avenue tonight without bringing up John Christner. And one of the things John Christner and Charlie Blodgett shared was the fact that they owned the Charles Hotel. Blodgett owned it as the Charles Hotel, John owned it as Charles Apartments. But they also owned something else. This is the hotel that sat on the corner of 2nd and Central before the Hotel Charles was built. It's called the Eagle Hotel. It had a number of different names. It was built in 1881, then it burnt down. It was put up in 1887 after the fire. I don't have all the names written there, but Central House, it was the Milwaukee House, it was the Commercial House, but generally it's referred to as the Eagle Hotel or the Eagle House. When Blodgett purchased the property to put up the new hotel, he had this building taken down. A guy named Jake Wilhelm took down the building brick by brick and moved it to his farm out south of town near the waterworks, near the power plant. And then when this building was down, he put up a new building. And so here's the building that is actually the Eagle Hotel yet. It's what we referred to as the Big Brothers Big Sisters. It was used for the radio cab office. But that is the Eagle Hotel that was built by Jake Wilhelm a couple years after the Hotel Charles was put up. What's interesting about it is Charlie Blodgett owned that hotel before it was taken down, and before John died, he also owned that building. So when you look at history repeating itself, it's kind of neat to see the stories and how things are connected to things in town. And John was always very proud to have called the Hotel Charles his. But when he found out that this was also the Eagle Hotel, he was equally as pleased. So that's going to kind of wrap up what we're going to talk about here.